Ladies and gentlemen, I cannot think of a better time for a session of this kind, and the person who's going to be joining us right now live from the national capital. This is a virtual session, as Preeti just told us. As you know, social media is frequently in the hot seat. You're seeing it make all the headlines right now in the big Twitter versus government collision that's taking place right now. It has implications for companies across the board in the social media sphere. And our guest right here at Conclave East 21 is Ajit Mohan. He's Vice President and Managing Director of Facebook India. Ajit, welcome. Really good to see you. Wish you were here with us, but great to have you nevertheless. A very, very interesting time, Ajit, and I want to dive straight into it because, ladies and gentlemen, let's not forget that Facebook pervades everyone's lives in this country mostly, because in one way or the other, you've got Facebook in your life. The numbers are staggering. It's somehow so inadequate to call Facebook a social media company, because we all know it's so much more than that. It's a part of our life. It's not just how we express ourselves, but also how we communicate, and it's very much in the news these days as well. Ajit, I want to dive straight into something that we've been covering journalistically. It's been in the news, and so I want to start strong with that. You've got this big collision between the government and Twitter as far as public policy is concerned, and that is also the topic of this conversation, Ajit, on the banning of handles and things like that. And I know Twitter doesn't concern you, but the implications of what happens in this collision, and permit me to say collision because it's seen to be something that's escalating day on day. There are pretty aggressive statements that have come out from the government. Twitter has defended. How do you see it? How do you see it, and what kind of implications it may have for the relationship between the Indian government and social media companies?
Shiv, thank you for having me. Would have loved to have been there in person. Let me step back and talk about the overall context, Shiv, as you mentioned, rather than dive into a particular aspect of another company. And I want to call out a few things, Shiv. One, there's no question that we benefit as a company that believes in freedom of speech and expression. We definitely benefit from the ability to operate in India with freedom on the back of an open internet. I think across Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp, as a company, we have benefited from it. And I genuinely also think if you look at the last few years in terms of the dramatic explosion and access to the internet in India, while a lot of the focus may be on content moderation, I do think there's been extraordinary leaps that India has made that really allows us as a country to leverage the internet to make dramatic improvements in people's lives, and in many ways to create new models for the world as a whole. So I think for me, that is the starting point. The second point to address your question is, I do think, and I think you alluded to it, Shiv.
Yes.
As a company, when we have platforms like Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp, and as you mentioned, we benefit from the fact that hundreds of millions of Indians, they live their lives on these platforms. Can you hear me, Chef? Anything you want me to do different?
We can hear you, Ajit. Go ahead.
Okay. We do absolutely have a responsibility. We absolutely have a responsibility to make sure that even as these platforms are used for free expression, they're deeply embedded in the lives of Indians every day. Equally, we also have a responsibility when it comes to making sure that we do everything we can to reduce harm. And there is always a trade-off. And the way we deal with those trade-offs is through the articulation of our community standards that are global in nature. That allows us to say what kind of behavior is not allowed on our platforms. And a lot of those community standards were developed over the years with inputs from multiple stakeholders, including governments around the world, that allows us to create these canvases for expression, especially in a democratic country like India, while equally allowing us to play the obligation and responsibility we have to keep users safe. And the third one that I want to mention is we do have under Section 69A of the law,
Yes.
we have established protocols for engaging with the government, in this case, the IT ministry, for orders that we receive from the governments outside of the actions that we do under our community standards. And as a responsible company, we absolutely respect Indian law. And I believe that the process that we have established, both under the law and through clarifications from the courts in India, allows us as private companies, as social media companies, to engage with the government, to articulate our point of view, and then to take the necessary measures. And those protocols have been in place, Shiv, for a long time. And I trust those processes. We engage sincerely on the back of what is clearly articulated as protocols under Section 69A. So hopefully that gives you a context of how we at Facebook think about it. Sure.
Ajit, since you mentioned the IT ministry as well as, community standards that have been worked upon, to quote the IT minister today, in fact, he actually said that misuse of social media will not be tolerated and action will be taken. You just spoke about the modalities under which you can interface with the government on issues like this and respect for the law. Can you tell us about whether this perceived misuse of social media has gone down? Facebook itself has had run-ins with the government and a conversation on this in the past as well. Can you give us any specific data or indications of whether community standards or the tweaks to those community standards have resulted in less misuse?
I think we are aligned on the objective in India and globally, Shiv, that as much as platforms like ours enable hundreds of millions of users and businesses to build what they consider important, to connect with friends and family, to expand the canvas of expression, we're absolutely aligned on the agenda that we don't want our platforms to be misused. And therefore, over the last few years in particular, Shiv, we have invested an extraordinary amount of energy and resources and investments to make sure that whether it is in our automated systems that can pick up content on the platform that violates our community standards even before they get distribution, to engaging with civil society and governments and experts to understand how those standards can evolve. We are aligned on that agenda because the reality is, as much as our platforms have enabled people all over the world to create enormous value, to make it easier to connect with each other, we also have a responsibility and to recognize that sometimes there is a small minority of people and actions on the platform that can cause harm. And we want to make sure that that misuse doesn't happen. So I think we have been very public about this, not just in India but globally. And I see that as an aligned objective.
Coming to WhatsApp, because that's the other big thing that's been in the news recently, for a variety of reasons. There were some leaks. There was the terms of use issue that became a problem. We saw the front page ads where Facebook tried to clarify on that. Can you tell us a little bit about the learning experiences off of that, Ajit? Because I mean, WhatsApp is here to stay. We've seen people going in droves to rival apps like Signal, etc. But people are still using WhatsApp in enormous numbers. If I'm not mistaken, 350 million is the number of users that you have in the country at this time as far as WhatsApp is concerned. You've got an audience that's plugged in from all over the country, probably all over the world right now. Can you tell us clearly, Ajit, what the issue was with WhatsApp? Has it been sorted now? How would you address concerns that continue to linger in people's minds about the privacy of WhatsApp? Because that's the one app that truly unites us all in this country.
Absolutely, Shiv. And like I'm sure almost 100% of people in the room my life is on WhatsApp as well.
Yeah.
And I think one thing that I want to say is the commitment to encryption on WhatsApp and privacy is absolute. We cannot read your messages. We cannot read anyone's messages. That's always been true. That will always remain true. And and I'll come to explaining sort of what are the learnings from how we rolled out the privacy policy and what we're taking from it. But I think it's important to, uh, without any caveats, be very clear that no one can read the messages. We don't have access to the messages because they're end-to-end encrypted, and therefore that is never at risk. The second part, Shiv, is in many ways, I think the few weeks in January also gave an indication of something that I think at WhatsApp we have known for a long time, that people genuinely care about the privacy and sanctity of their communication. And if there is even an assumption that the messages are not private, then there will be other apps that will provide those alternatives. And I think you mentioned that WhatsApp will always be around. We hope so, but we also know that there is a lot of competition. As much as Facebook as a company has platforms that are large and we benefit from the loyalty of people around the country, and we're deeply embedded in the social fabric of India, I think we have to earn the trust every day. And whenever another service can come up with a better proposition, there's competition, so we don't take that for granted. Now, having said all of this, especially that nothing about the policy changes that the sanctity and encryption of those messages stays, I do want to acknowledge that I think we could have done a better job in terms of how we rolled out the changes in privacy policy. I don't think we did a great job of explaining it, but I want to make a distinction between what the policy does and the intent behind it, and of course, the way in which it was rolled out. And it may not be easy to understand for people who look at this and say, you're a large company. If you're being so clear, why could you not have been this clear early? And one of the things is, in the company with the WhatsApp global teams and products and engineers, the idea that encryption is at the heart, the privacy and sanctity of the messages is at the heart of the service, is so deeply embedded. I think we almost probably forgot that we may need to assert that and clarify that every time.
Yeah.
Because that is so deeply understood that there is never going to be a challenge to it. And I think that our conviction may be limited us from understanding that anytime there are changes, it creates anxiety. The other part that I do want to call out, Shiv, is in the internet world, all platforms have their terms of service, right? We call it privacy policy, TOS, terms of service. One of the things that you saw from WhatsApp was extreme transparency. It was WhatsApp flagging overtly, saying, hey, let us tell you what we are doing, in a way that I think actually raises the bar for transparency in the internet. Every day, there are lots of apps where there are changes to the terms of service, changes to policies. Because the conviction on transparency is so high, WhatsApp as a team said, let's be very clear. But I think as we did that, I think we should have understood that in a world where there is a lot of misinformation, where people are anxious about, what does it really mean in terms of all kinds of different platforms and services on the internet, I think we should have done a much better job of explaining what we did. And what we have done is, from a policy point of view, a lot of the changes were already done in 2016. What we were being more transparent about in January, Shiv, was that when people communicate with businesses, nothing changes on the encryption, but those businesses can have access to tools that allow some of that, the data to be leveraged in a way where I think if you kind of for example, if I tell you that if you're running a small shop and you're getting inquiries from customers,
Yes.
let's make it easier to build tools so that you can respond to multiple customers at the same time. You would look at it and say, yeah, absolutely, that makes sense. So it was hyper transparency, but I acknowledge that I think we could have explained it much better. I think everyone should know that WhatsApp cannot read your messages. Nothing changes about encryption.
Okay, I'm glad you clarified that, Ajit, but I just want to dwell on WhatsApp just for a minute longer because, like I said, this is something that connects to everyone and everyone's interested, especially in what happens with WhatsApp. I know many people who, when this whole privacy issue happened, lots of people downloaded the Signal app, groups shifted to Signal, things like that. Can you give us a sense of whether this was damaging to WhatsApp, or has WhatsApp, in a sense, weathered that entire storm? Because there were big gains to be made by your rival apps at that time.
I think, Shiv, two parts to it. One part is, I absolutely believe that we have to earn the trust of people every day. I don't think this is an episodic event where you look at this and say, hey, we are through it, we are in good shape. I think we have to earn the trust and keep the trust every day. And honestly, I think the teams at WhatsApp, the product managers and the engineers and the leadership and Facebook as a company, we are all very vested in the idea of, we want to make sure that even people who found this confusing and therefore or received a lot of misinformation, we want to make sure that we are able to reach out to them and tell them what we are doing and what we are not, and earn the trust, or even for those who trust us still, make sure that we reinforce that. Having said that, I think, Shiv, to more directly answer your question, Will, who's the global head of WhatsApp, did mention that in a couple of weeks ago that as a service, we haven't seen a massive negative impact because of this. But that doesn't mean that we don't acknowledge that we could have done a much better job of explaining it, or that competition will continue to be intense, and that we have to earn the trust and keep the trust.
It's good. I will admit it's going to be very difficult for most people to leave WhatsApp, given, like you just said, that their entire lives, their work, their families, everything is on WhatsApp. So it's interesting to hear from you, but I'm also not surprised to hear that there wasn't much damage. Now, this is the Conclave-East, Ajit, as you know, and we're about to enter into another election season here in Bengal, but elsewhere in the country as well. We all well know, not just here in India, but around the world, elections are a time when there's a lot of fake news that's, does the rounds. On the specific issue of fake news and the handling of fake news, can you tell us about any new features, any new tools or capabilities that Facebook either has or will be testing as we enter another election cycle? Not specific to this election cycle, but are there any new things that Facebook is trying to battle fake news?
It's a great question, Shiv, and I think both in terms of playing the responsible role to ensure the integrity of elections around the world, and to do the best that we can to limit misinformation on our platforms. In many ways, you called out two agenda that have been critical for us for a while, especially after 2016. And our approach to elections has evolved on the back of experiencing multiple elections around the world, including elections in India. And in the Indian context, that framework largely relies on three material things. One, going back to 2019, working with industry associations and working with our peers, we have a collaboration with the Election Commission that essentially creates a collaborative code of conduct and framework for us to take down orders that we receive from ECI. That process has been quite well established. I think over the last few elections, it has worked out well, including the election in Bihar. And that continues to be the case. And I think the Election Commission itself is on record calling out the work that platforms like ours have done in both, creating that collaborative framework as well as adhering to what we have agreed with ECI. I think the second one is we work with 8 fact-checking organizations in 11 languages, including Bengali.
Yeah.
India Today, as you know, is one of them.
Yes.
And India is one of the countries where we have some of the largest number of fact-checkers. And we will continue to invest in that program. And essentially, it is to make sure that, I think, Shiv, you know this, one of the criticisms about the company has been that you should not be the arbiter for what is factual and what is fake news.
Indeed.
And we agree with that. We don't want to be the arbiters of truth. And therefore, we are relying on fact-checking organizations who have been certified by the International Fact-Checking Network, and essentially relying on fact-checkers who now have experience. They've used the tools in our systems over the last few years, and essentially when they call out something as misinformation, we limit the distribution. And the third part, and this is an example where I do think as a company, we have raised the bar for the industry, is on transparency of political ads. It's very easy to find out, which entity is putting out ads, including political ads around elections on Facebook. And we have clear protocols in terms of the identification of the organizations. We archive those ads for 7 years. And I think even today, I would argue that the extent of transparency that we provide on our platforms and how different parties and players are using political ads, I think it's a benchmark that continues to be an outlier. So that approach will continue. And all of this has been influenced by elections over the last few years, including the many elections in India.
Yeah. Speaking of unverified content, questionable content, I don't think any actions can be compared to the tectonic suspension of Donald Trump's accounts recently, Ajit. Now, I know you weren't directly involved in that, but everyone's been really curious about what that was like from the inside. For companies like yours to take those big decisions, I mean, I can only imagine what kind of a decision this was. Give us an inside view of what it must have been like to finally decide to pull the plug on someone like a Trump.
I think, Shiv, while
because it was something that was building up. That's why I'm saying many of his tweets were constantly marked as incorrect or questionable or unverified, and then the ban happened.
I think Mark has spoken about this publicly, Shiv, and when you think about a lot of what we have been saying, including from the CEO Mark to the leader in public policy, Nick Clegg. If you look at the founding of the company, we genuinely do believe that part of our responsibility is to expand the canvas of expression, right? And therefore, even as over the years, we have introduced new tools and systems and policies to the point that you mentioned in the beginning, limit the misuse of our platforms, to limit misinformation on our platforms. The bias always has been on the side of freedom of expression. And I think Mark has been very public and vocal and articulate about it in ways that created a lot of debates around the world. So if there has been any bias, it has been a bias towards keeping as much speech as possible, especially from political leaders, especially from elected leaders.
Yeah.
Because these are, especially in democracies like ours, in India, in the US, these are leaders who have been elected. What they say in many ways is consequential. People want to hear them. So, if anything, that is the additional canvas, right? That not just bias towards speech, but especially the intent to have people listen to their elected leaders in as unfiltered a fashion as possible. So you can imagine that with all of those principles in place, some of the actions we took on the back of the violence in Capitol Hill, um, uh, there was no precedence for it. It was a situation that had no parallel, and I think reached a point where the calls that we took were the only right things to do in the context of what was happening, and in the context of our obligation in the United States, and being a responsible internet company.
Okay, because the banning of Trump, continues to be one of the biggest social media stories of our times. Given that that really was his platform, that was something that Donald Trump depended on in such a big way, and that has spawned other apps, other platforms now, and the effect of the sort of ripple effect of that is going to still be felt, I assume, in the weeks and months ahead. Speaking of other apps, Ajit, Atmanirbharta in technology, in tech, Indian apps. In the last couple of days, we've seen, the Coup app on Twitter. We've seen a drove of union ministers going to that app. There's a message sort of being sent out, between the foreign apps and the so-called Atmanirbhar apps. Where do you stand on that? What did you think of this whole Coup affair on Twitter, going viral? And the thing is, it wasn't just a sort of flash in the pan, because you had ministers going there, setting up accounts there, putting out posts from there.
Again, I think, Shiv, I kind of tend to zoom out from the news of the moment and try and think in terms of, in the context of India, what is right for the country? What is right for building up tech capacity in India? And I have 3 points to make there. One is, I do genuinely think something big happened in the last 4 or 5 years. And all credit to the Digital India agenda and the enabling policies, as well as the work of platforms like Jio and Airtel and Vodafone. And the innovation that Jio triggered in 2016, we have more than 500 to 600 million people who came online with access to affordable, high-quality broadband internet.
Yeah.
It hasn't happened anywhere else in the world with this space. And the reality is, this continues to be the case, right? We will get to 1 billion people with access to the internet soon. So I absolutely think we should look at, and because so much has happened in such a short period of time, I'm not sure whether all of us have really absorbed what does it mean for all of us to drive innovation, create models not just for India but for the world, and fundamentally leapfrog on the back of the foundations that's been built. And that agenda, I think it's the right agenda. I think as a country, we have an opportunity, given what's happened in the last 5 years, to spur massive innovation, to look at fundamental opportunities in sectors like education and healthcare,
Yeah.
And really think about, how do we enable this massive canvas that we have created for ourselves to experiment and pilot and spur new models and innovation. And a lot of that will come from new ventures and new startups. So that's one thing. Second is, I actually think there is always going to be intense competition. I think often we kind of reduce this discussion and debate to, there are these very large foreign companies and there are these small Indian companies. Yeah. I don't think it's true anymore. I think all of us have to wake up every day and compete with each other. I think to our earlier conversation, the minute there is misinformation about WhatsApp's privacy policy, I think 5 other players can step in and provide a competing proposition. Many of them will be local, many of them may not be local, and that's true in every sector. So I actually think there is a lot of intense competition in the internet space, and it's only going to get more intense, and I think that's the right thing. Competition will spur all of us to do better. I want to call out one more thing, Shiv,
yes.
And I think it's extremely important. Part of my agenda leading Facebook in the country, and with the platforms that we have in Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp, is to make sure, to the point that you started with, these are platforms that are deeply embedded in the fabric of India.
Yes.
People use it every day. People trust us. Part of my job is to make sure that these platforms can be used to drive the growth of other internet companies, and especially local startups,
right,
especially Indian companies. That's our entire business model, is how can other companies leverage the tools that we provide, leverage the scale that we provide to build their own growth. And our interests are aligned here. I'm passionate about that personally, but the company's self-interests are aligned with the interest of growing other platforms. So my response to all of this is the canvas is so big. Our opportunity to spur models that will allow India to leapfrog, as well as allow Indian companies and global companies to create models out of India that are exciting for the world, is so massive. Let's chase those big opportunities. Because there's been a lot of hard work done in the last few years that got us here.
And after a pandemic of this kind, that's a great note to end on. The opportunity is absolutely enormous. Access to quality internet is only going to go up. With 5G coming at some point in the future, things are going to move in a huge new direction, and there's much to look forward to in this space. Thanks very much for shining the light, Ajit. It was a pleasure to have you. And thanks for answering all of those questions. We look forward to what Facebook has next for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chef.